Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Music Masterclass for today, January 14th, 2021. And I am hopefully going to not have the technical issues that I had with the cafe yesterday. That sounds better to me. I actually don't know what the problem was. I'm just hoping. Okay, welcome again, everyone. And I'm going to take a quick look at the chat and see who's here. People from all over the place: Germany, Virginia, Utah. This is so cool. I just love this. Um, so fun. Um, all right, so I've mentioned that one of the things that I am going to have on my mind going forward here is counterpoint, and I'm not going to be like a one track whatever on the subject, but it comes up fairly often in different situations. And let me actually bring up what I have as the most recent version I just built of what's very soon to be released as MuseScore 3.6, and I just want to get my current build running here. Um, the subject of counterpoint is something I'm very interested in, and I'll be teaching this course on it. And I should show you. This is the textbook. I think I may have showed you last time that I will be using. It's one of the few textbooks that covers both kind of Renaissance and Baroque styles of counterpoint. But it's more than just like there's two styles of counterpoint and that's all there is in the world. But counterpoint is like a big subject, and although we usually teach it in a specific context involving imitative counterpoint, there's much more to the subject than that. It's really a much more general thing. And so I want to take a look at one of the submissions that came up here, and it's this here, William Halstead's uh, composition here for strings. And I have this piece. I looked at it, listened to it, and we started having kind of a discussion about this in the class, and maybe some of you have seen it. And essentially, what's happening is it's written for three instruments that are largely doing the same thing, if for lack of a better way of putting it. In other words, we have this violin melody here. I'll start it here. My claps there are showing you that the first violin part is actually that those are where those first violin notes happen, and you don't really even hear them because they are doubling the second violin there, and that's really fine. But then as we go on, right, so the cello comes in also basically duplicating what the melody is doing. So we have three parts that are all, in some sense, doing what the melody is doing. Now, this is fine. There are any number of pieces that might start off with a unison passage, and then maybe you expect it to break into harmony. And the question came up with this piece, well, it's really a lot of that. There's a few places where it actually does split into harmony, but it spends an awful lot of its time just basically having all three voices state the melody. So that's a fine texture in itself. I have nothing against unison textures or octave textures. They're great textures. But the point was made that, all right, if you want it to sound more orchestral, you want it to sound bigger, you've got these three instruments, you're capable of having chords happening. So let me flop over here to the chat again, make sure I'm not missing out on stuff. So that is the conundrum here. We have this piece that was conceived of as just a melody, and then the question is, well, what do we do to harmonize it? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a few suggestions. In other words, I'm going to try a few things out to show you some basic approaches that you might use when this comes up. So let's see, I need to get to my score because I did save this score already, but I rebooted, so I hopefully won't have the glitches, audio glitches that I had in the cafe yesterday. All right, so here is that string trio. All right, so the first thing that I notice in doing this is that really the melody here is in the second violin, and that's fine. But normally if there's two violins, we might expect the main melody to be in the first violin. It's not a problem that it isn't, and there's some places where it changes over and it is that way. So I'm not going to worry about that, but I am going to just point out that if you're deliberately trying to create a duet and share melodic duties, that's great, but it's something to think about. What I want to do is talk about strategies, and I'm talking big picture strategies for how we're going to go about harmonizing this thing. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to save a new version of it so I don't mess up the original. And William, hopefully you're here and can be following along because I did give you a heads up on that. And yeah, I think these are other tempo. I think we know what this is about too. Let me just get rid of that. Oh, wow. So we don't even have a violin sound for that. I think maybe he was using a different sound font or something. Not really sure about that, but let's switch these to violin, shall we? I want violin expressive, and I want violin. So, by the way, if you don't know this, you will see that there's a violin and then there's violin expressive. The expressive, and that is the case for all the stringed instruments, all the wind instruments. The expressive version is the version that can respond to single note dynamic. So if you have like a crescendo over a whole note, you need the expressive version of the sound. So I think this is just called cello. It is. Okay, cello expressive. So probably he had changed up some sound fonts and had violin sounds, but I'm hearing other sounds. And I'll add a new tempo marking because I had to get rid of the other one. I think it said 65. All right, so we have this, and what I wanted to talk about was our overall kind of strategies that we might use in harmonizing these things. And okay, yeah, William, it was so this is why that's why I had different sounds. All right, so the melody is supposed to be the first violins here. So this bum 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 bum. So if this is the melody and this is moving stuff underneath it, that's really good information to know. Because I would say that these sounds are so short and are duplicated by what this violin is doing, that if you really intended this to be heard as the melody, then I would not be looking at giving this part the same notes. In other words, so instead of this E, so I don't even know what you're thinking harmonically here, if you're thinking about any particular chord. But I'm just going to make a couple little adjustments here. I'm going to try to say, well, what if I change that to an A, just to have a different note happening? I'm just looking for a note that I think is going to harmonize. I'll put a G here, and I'll just leave this one a B for a moment. All right, so let's just hear what this sounds like now. Oh, I need to change this G also. I don't need to, but the point is, if I have the melody, there we go. I just made some really random changes. So I'm not claiming that I like the notes that I chose, but the point is, now I'm hearing the first violin. It's not that the second violin was literally drowning it out in the sense of being too loud. It's that the melody was subsumed within this harmony part, and so we never really got to hear this melody, bum, 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 bum. But now we can hear it, and we can hear the second part. Mm, 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 mm. Right? So just by avoiding doubling those notes. So, William, we were talking about parallel octaves, and these weren't even octaves, these were unisons. And the point is, if you're trying to sound like you have two separate parts, then having them come together in these places, basically everywhere the melody happens, it causes us to not even hear this part. We really only hear one part. We really only hear the moving part. But as soon as you have two different notes, well, we hear the different notes. So that is a general principle that I can lump into this general category of talking about counterpoint. We're talking about how to have independent parts. Because now I'm hearing this as a melody and this as something else. Now, I do notice there's dynamic markings here, and so it should be the case that that melody is louder. But this doesn't really sound as quiet as I expect. Let me just see if I re-add that dynamic. Yeah, I feel like that dynamic isn't being honored quite strongly enough, so I'm going to pull it down that much more. I'm still going to call it P because that's just a MuseScore playback thing. Okay, and notice when those two notes came together, they jumped out. And that's what happens when you have something that's otherwise independent textures, but they come together briefly. It will jump out of the texture like that. Okay, so I mentioned that there's different approaches to harmonizing things. Now that I know that this moving line is considered accompaniment to this top part, this changes my thinking a little bit, but I'm going to I'm going to maybe put that aside for a moment, my thinking. I'm not sure what I'm doing, actually, to be honest. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a few extra measures here to play with. And I'm going to just take those first four measures of the melody and talk about the basically three ways that we could go about harmonizing this. And when I say three ways of doing it, I mean that at some level, all music can be broken up and looked at in one of these three ways. I'm not going to claim that this is some big universal truth that every person who ever thinks about music would characterize it this way, but it's something that I've started realizing. So let me tell you what these three ways are. One way is with if I have, say, three instruments like this, and now I'm looking at harmonizing it. One way is to do some sort of static harmony where I decide what chord I want to harmonize, maybe one measure at a time. It's not always exactly one measure at a time, but whatever. And then you just basically give them what in the arranging world we call footballs. It's footballs because they are ovals in 4/4 time, whole notes basically, except you're in 3/4 time, so they're going to be dotted half notes. And so I want to do a version of it where I just give you some footballs. So maybe this is kind of an E minor sound that I see here, so I'm going to give this an E, and then this feels like it's maybe a D major. And I am a little concerned that basically I am reproducing, in other words, I'm doubling the melody. The melody is the root of the chord that I'm saying this is, and that's a little concerning to me. So maybe instead of putting the root in the melody of this D, I'm going to make it be an F sharp, so it's a D chord. Now this whole process of deciding what chords you want, that's a whole other subject. That's the study of harmony. What I'm talking about isn't about changing the chords. I mean, I'm going to quickly come up with some chords, but now I'm going to talk about the different ways of expressing those chords. So this is what I would call the football approach, where you just create a really simple static accompaniment like this. And it's really a quite common approach. And then here I see a D and a G, and this is suggesting to me maybe a G chord, especially coming after the D chord. And then maybe this is an A chord. I don't know, I'm just making up chords. All right, if these are the chords, then I need to put in the other part, I need to fill out this chord. And so maybe I'm going to give this one, say, the third of the chord here, and maybe I'm just trying to fill out the chord a little bit. This is filling out the chord, D, F sharp, A. And now here I need the B. And this is kind of nice because these two footballs here are moving in parallel thirds, which is kind of nice. So let's hear what this sounds like. I need to make these guys quieter, right? So let's give them a piano. Okay, so I'm not claiming that those are necessarily the chords you want there, but they're the chords I've decided to go with. So this basic approach of writing essentially footballs, it's not a technical term, but it is a commonly used term among arrangers. It's the thing you do when you don't have any better idea of what you want to do. You just write long notes, and then you allow the melody to be heard over those long notes. In the synthesizer world, these are called pads. And it doesn't have to be that simple. You could change it to, instead of being E, or cello, sorry, E, it could be E, 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 F sharp, or no, 3 beat, sorry. E, 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 F sharp, G, 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 A, like that kind of thing where you're creating some sort of rhythm out of it. And that works really well for stringed instruments, actually. So if I wanted to, be E, E, oh, I don't know where I got that note as being E in my mind, but E, and then E, E, and then F sharp. Oops. F sharp, F sharp, F sharp, F sharp. So I could do that, right? So it's still conceptually just those footballs, but I'm at least creating some sense of rhythmic interest with what I'm doing. So it's still very static, right? We're just sticking with one note throughout that measure, but we're doing something a little bit interesting with it rhythmically. And it's kind of nice actually having that kind of change up there. I might go with something like that. But so this is, when I say there's basically 3 approaches, this is one of them, and I'll call it the static approach because football just feels too slangy, too specific to kind of the world of arrangers writing this kind of music. So it's a static approach. You basically give all the other parts long notes or repeated notes. It could be 16th note, right? It could be that going instead. But it's something static where it's just stating the harmony very clearly and simply for the melody to be heard over. Now, in this case, this melody is a super, super simple melody. And when I say by simple, I mean it's not what I originally thought was the melody. I thought of this moving stuff was the melody because it's really interesting. This is like a simpler melody. And then eventually maybe this does start to stand out more and be heard more as the melody. I see other places where right there it actually is in some sort of harmony and we have eighth notes happening. But in any case, even if then you wanted your melody to be, say, more than just the simple notes like this, we could have Dun, dun, oops. Dun, okay, so I just added some passing tones in here. So I'm not trying to tell you to change the melody. I'm just saying if the melody had been more moving, if the melody had been moving like this static approach to the harmony actually becomes a very strong possibility. But that, your melody was meant to be simpler than that. So in that case, I might not have gone with a harmony that was so static. So if static approaches like this are, I said, one possibility, well, what are some of the other possibilities? Well, let's take a look at that. So the next possibility that I'll talk about, and again, I'll just copy the melody in, is what I would call a homophonic approach. And this is basically chorale writing. Yeah, okay, so the movement in the second violin is creating rhythm, and that is definitely the idea. You want there to be some form of motor rhythm. And maybe what that means is, so here you're creating so much interest with that it is, I would say, taking over. So let me actually do one other thing, because this is now becoming really interesting to me. What if I just made these notes longer, right? Made them into dotted quarter notes. You've written them as really short notes, but what if I make them dotted quarter notes and get rid of these staccattissimos here? And see what that sounds like. So by doing that, now this melody is singing on top of that in a way that now that melody is too quiet. I mean, that counter melody is too quiet. I can barely even hear that thing at piano. So I'd be better off making it like maybe just mezzo forte. Let's hear this now. Right. Okay, so that idea that if you want to feel this motor rhythm, a motor rhythm is a kind of technical term also that we use in the arranging world or composing world. The idea that you have some repeating rhythmic motif, whether it's just a steady stream of eighth notes or like my motif, my motor rhythm here was bum 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 and that was my motor rhythm. That's what you do in a setting like, I come from the jazz world a lot and live in the jazz world a lot, and there you expect to have a drummer sitting here keeping a beat for you and a bass player and maybe a rhythm guitar in a pop context. You can totally imagine different rhythm instruments, the rhythm section, creating these motor rhythms. But in an orchestral setting like this, it's typically strings churning out this motor rhythm with their bows, because it's kind of the best to use strings for that because they don't have to breathe. Other wind instruments will have to breathe, and that's going to break up your motor rhythm unless there's rests built into your motor rhythm. So okay, so yeah, I like the idea of that motor rhythm, but I would say if you want the melody to be heard more, maybe you want a little space. Let me try that. So just by letting that note come forward more, we're now hearing these separately. All right, so this was this sort of static approach where I either had footballs or I gave them a motor rhythm. The next approach is what I call a homophonic approach, and here I'm going to harmonize each note. Now, it might be the same chord, and I might just change the voicing of the chord. So I'm going to keep using that E chord, but maybe I'm going to change up what notes I use. So like for the, what I'll do is I'm just going to copy this down, but then change the pitches. So there's actually a mode for that I seldom use because then I forget to turn it off, but here it is. Control-Shift-I will put you in this mode. And all I have to do is pick my other pitches, G, and then maybe B. And then here I'm going to go with, what were my notes again? An A, and I'm going to go with the A, and then maybe a D. And then down here, I could keep that E, And then in this measure, I'll keep that, in that note, I'll keep the E. Here, I'll go to that F sharp. And then, you know what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to change this one to an F sharp and change this one to the root D. So I'm making some harmonic decisions here. I'm still talking about an E minor chord here. This is still E, G, and we're missing a B on the first beat, but in the middle of the measure, we get the B, right? So E, G, B in the middle of the measure. Here, I'm still talking about a D major chord. I have my D, F sharp, and A. And then my melody changed to A, and now I'm changing the other voices too. Now the F sharp is here and the D is here, but I still have all three notes of my chord accounted for. And then I wanted a G chord, so I think I want this guy to be a B, and this guy to be a G, and then maybe here I'll put this one on a D and let this one be the B. So here again I have a full G chord, and here a full G chord. The only time I didn't have a full chord was here. The very first one, I just have an E and a G. I have no B. I don't mind missing out on the fifth. I don't mind doubling the root like that. Let's hear what this sounds like. This is again what I would call a homophonic approach. Every time the melody changed, the other parts changed. And then I didn't do anything for that last measure. But notice that, that's just a different texture from what I originally had. And then verses. So this is what I mean in saying they're two really different types of textures. There's this static texture where you give this pad underneath these footballs down in the harmony parts, and then there's this homophonic texture where you let them all move together. The homophonic texture here is, I would say, maybe not as effective, or it's not doing what I expect homophonic textures to do, because, well, it actually is. But if I talk about what a homophonic texture normally consists of, it's usually much more about I'm looking for one of my example pieces. That, of course, I never remember where I put anything because I do too many different things. But I think, yeah, I can't even remember which one of these might have it. But, I mean, you've all seen, well, many of you have seen anyhow, things like my We Gather Together arrangement that I did back for Thanksgiving, in which a lot of it is that same type of thing. So here is what I'm talking about. These two parts are moving together. That's homophony. And then here, right, each part is moving in the same rhythm. They're all moving in exactly the same rhythm. And yes, I have actual rhythm section instruments that are providing additional accompaniment there, and that's the luxury we get in the pop world or the jazz world of having these rhythm section instruments. And so we can use certain things like homophony here and yet still have that sense of pulse. When you're writing for a string trio, you've got to create your own pulse. And so you look at this and go, well, now there's no pulse. Well, that's true, because your homophonic texture, if the melody is very sparse, then a homophonic texture is going to give you a sparse thing. So we've looked at this idea of these footballs, or this static texture. We've looked at the homophonic texture. When I said there's three different approaches here, the third one is going to be what I would call counterpoint. And counterpoint is, I mean, this counts as counterpoint too, I should mention. The static approach, because now it means these two parts, the second violin and the cello, have one idea happening, and the melody has a different idea happening. And when I say idea, I really mean rhythms. If if two parts have the same rhythm but the same notes, at some level we hear them together, and that's what homophony is. Um, uh, everyone moving in the same rhythm. As soon as we talk about having different rhythms between the parts, we're talking polyphony. We're talking polyphonic. We're talking multiple rhythms at once, multiple sounds at once. So as soon as we talk about multiple rhythms at once, then that's when we start talking about real polyphony, as opposed to this, which is more homophony or homophony. That sounds funny to say it that way, so homophony, I think, is the better pronunciation. So what you have written here is a form of this polyphony counterpoint. At least it is once you make those adjustments that I made to the notes. If you remember, originally that was an E, and that was a G in that octave, and this was a D, and that was an A, right? Originally it was this. And I, of course, lengthen the notes also. So let me go back to what you had originally. So originally, you had this. So here, what's happening is we're not hearing two independent things anymore. We're really only hearing one thing. We're hearing the second violin part, and the first violin part just feels like it's emphasizing some of the second violin's notes. If we want to hear them as distinct, then we need them to not only have different rhythms, but also different pitches. Because otherwise our ear isn't able to separate them. And I think that's what I would say is going on. And that's why I made those changes that I made. Now, you have some note choices here that aren't the notes that I had. It's like your choice, you have, this is really more about a C chord. And I had made it be an E minor chord, right? So I probably should have made that a C chord if I were paying attention to what you did and wanting to use your harmonization. So what you have is two different things happening rhythmically, but again, note-wise, it's the same. Now, over when you bring the cello in again, at this point, I'm going to claim that you really still only have one thing happening because, again, everyone, when they come together, they're coming together on the same pitches. And yet, you do have something that feels like different rhythms because this is just the bump, and this is do, and this is dum, bum, bum, bum. Longer notes. It's the same rhythm as this, but longer. It's different rhythms, but because the pitches all line up, we can't appreciate them as different rhythms. Furthermore, I would suggest that maybe this, the cello and the first violin, although they have different note durations, their attacks and their, the actual note changes happen at the same time. So they both consist of a bow on one, a bow on the end of two, a bow on one, bow on the end of two, over and over. And so because of that, these two aren't as distinct rhythmically or harmonic or note-wise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try something different here. I'm going to go back to note input mode, regular note input mode, and I'm just going to enter something that is more different. By more different, what do I mean? It's going to be its own rhythm. That's not the steady eighth notes and not the 1 and a 2, 1 and a 2. It's going to have its own character. And so what I'm going to do is start with a rest, because why not? I'm going to start with a quarter rest because I just feel like it. And then I'm going to bring in a note. And maybe, I don't know, I'm just writing some stuff. Pay no attention to what my notes are. I want to make that one dotted. And then do, boo, boom, boom. I just made up a melody. That this is now when we're talking counterpoint. I imagined its own melodic line. This is when we use the word counterpoint now, we usually really are referring to things like this, where this line is interesting in itself. So that's going to be my line. Let's hear it. Probably sounds not very good with everything else, but again, it'll illustrate the concept. Okay, let me get rid of these dynamics because now they're getting in my way. Because now I feel like these are all potentially equally interesting. But again, I'm going to make some of those changes so that my notes don't all line up. I'll let it go here. I'm just trying to make good music while I'm doing this, but I don't want to get too lost in the specifics of what my note choices are, because that's not actually what's important. All right, let's hear this. Okay, so yeah, I just threw that together, right? I didn't think out this melody. You heard me compose it on the spot. But the point is, that is what counterpoint is about. It's about thinking about your cello part not just as footballs, not just as this static, I'm going to play the root of my chord, not just thinking I'm going to do the same thing as the melody, but thinking, what could I do that's my own thing? You know, what could the cello do rhythmically that's its own interesting thing? And when you only have three parts like this, if you have all three parts doing different things rhythmically, well, now this is going to be a very contrapuntal sound. It's going to sound very much like Baroque and Renaissance music that really relies on that texture a lot. A lot of more modern music, and by more modern I mean 1700 forward, a lot of the music of Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin and Stravinsky and Duke Ellington and whoever else will have some counterpoint, but maybe only two things. You might have 20 people in your orchestra or 20 different parts in your orchestra, but really only two different things happening rhythmically, or maybe at most three, maybe one layer of footballs, one layer, and then two sort of contrapuntal layers against that. That would be a pretty typical type of texture. So, I said, I think that's a good observation, that because of the fact that these guys are here on the and of two, we are hearing this, at least I'm hearing it largely as 6/8. Now here is the first place that we've really heard bum, bum, bum. But everywhere else, what we heard was essentially the dotted quarter pulse. Bum. So without someone telling us about 3/4, we don't necessarily hear 3/4. So I've now forgotten if these are your original pitches. Excuse me, I can find that out really easily. Yes, those are your original. E, D, 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 D. Okay, so here, the fact that we have the repeated note between the and of one and then two, or this repeated note here between and of one and two, what's happening is this isn't very clearly saying 3/4. To me, that's part of the charm of this. I am not saying that you want to change this at all. But I would say, if the goal is to really feel like a waltz, really feel like 3/4 and not 6/8, because this feels like bum, 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 bum. So bum, 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 bum. That is how my ear parses this because of the fact that the melody is very clearly giving me that groupings of three. So if I really wanted to hear this as saying 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3. If these were supposed to be these syncopations against a 1, 2, 3, I think this line needs to be rewritten a little bit. I think it would need to be something that's more. Let me just change some stuff here. I'm going to change this to. I'm thinking about. I'm just going to get simple with this. All right, now that second violin part is clearly beating out 3, 4. And the melody now is going to be heard as these syncopations against that 3, 4. Except here, that A, notice how that A disappeared because it doubled that note. So I feel like this note really wants to be a different note. So let me do this. Right? So by doing that, now I'm feeling the 3, 4 because someone is explicitly saying 3, 4. Whereas before, it really felt like both of these, all the parts were really saying 6, 8, and I liked that. I thought that was effective. I'm not criticizing that choice at all. But since you mentioned that you wanted that second violin to be stating a waltz feel, I would say, had you done this, it would feel more waltz-like. Now, there's another point I should make while I'm talking about that. Yeah, so 3, 8, yeah, and that's true also. It's basically groups of 3, and then whether you see one group of 3 or 2 groups of 3, or for that matter, 4 groups of 3. You could say it's 12, 8, whatever. It's compound meter. But if you wanted it to feel more like that 3, 4, then you would want something like what I did. However, there's another thing worth considering. If you look at my sort of syncopated motor rhythm here, this is... There's something about bump, I could look at this and say it was ba 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 ba. I mean, does that? I don't even know if I conveyed the difference with my voice, but one of them was a clear sense of it was meant to be. Here's my pulse, ba ba and the other was ba ba bum ba ba bum. Bum, bum, bum. In other words, one of them, one way of thinking about it emphasized the quarter note pulse. One way of thinking about it emphasized the dotted quarter pulse. And what you could do to really make that more explicit is make these explicitly quarter notes in the cello and have that syncopation against it. And then here again, quarter notes, quarter, quarter, quarter. And now someone is stating a quarter note pulse that everything else can be heard against. And the fact that these two notes both line up together as a syncopation against that, now that's interesting to me. The other thing that I was going to say is there's a very specific waltz rhythm that is used in the jazz world a lot that is sometimes referred to as the "Who Parked the Car" rhythm. Do dum ga dum do dum ba dum do dum ba dum do dum ba dum. So I'm just going to put in that rhythm just so you can hear what it sounds like. G. Not that you're trying to write jazz, but I tend to not worry about making these sort of arbitrary, I'm writing this style of music or that style of music. I use the sound I want to use. And this is an interesting rhythm. And since you're already dealing with this idea of syncopation against a waltz rhythm, it's hard to not acknowledge that this sound that I'm about to show you here is consistent with it. So this is a jazz waltz rhythm. Boop bum ba dum boot, boop bum ba dum doo dum ba dum is the rhythm. It's doom dum. That's actually really slow for a jazz waltz, so that doesn't feel like a jazz waltz to me. But that's okay. We don't want it to sound like jazz anyhow, right? You're not trying to sound like jazz. But if this is now an interesting rhythm to me that says something about waltz, but says something about the syncopated rhythm, the syncopated melody note also. And I call it syncopated because, right, that note is on the and of two. It's not 1, 2, bum, 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 dun, dun, dun. That would be, I'm singing that wrong. Bum, 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 bum. I'm supposed to know how to do this, so let me try that again. Bum, 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 bum. Right? So if I was dun, 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 that would be not syncopated. Half note, quarter note, half note, quarter note. What you have here with all these notes on the and of two, that's syncopated. Anytime you have a note on the and of a beat that is not immediately followed by a note on the beat after it, that's an unresolved. Think of notes off the beat like this as creating tension. Tension's good, like do ba do da do dum. These notes off the beat are a form of tension that resolves when we land. Do da dum, do da dum. We want to land on a beat. If you ever go do da dum, do da dum, and you leave that note hanging, that's a form of, that's called syncopation. And that is what your rhythm is doing here in your melody, is you have these notes on the and of two that are not resolved. If it was bum, ba dum, then it wouldn't be syncopated. It's the fact that you have bum, it's this note on the and not resolved. That creates what's called syncopation. Again, not a bad thing. It's a great thing. We love syncopation. But it's good to put a name on it and understand what's happening, and then by doing that, have some idea about what that's going to mean for your accompaniment. So let me take a step back here, and again, remember the sort of three basic textures that I'm talking about. There's that static texture, where you have a melody and everyone else is doing very simple things, whether it's literally these footballs or maybe something that's static pitch-wise, like I'm staying on the same pitch, staying on the same pitch, or so it's basically staying on the same pitch for that entire measure, saying here's that chord, here's that E minor chord, here's that D chord, stating the chord and letting that sound just sort of wash there with no additional interest, no movement within this measure. It is rhythmic motion, but not melodic movement. So that's that static approach. This is the homophonic approach, where you let everyone move together with the melody. And generally speaking, you let everyone move. You may be someplace the melody would move and one of the other voices would stay the same. But if all the other voices stay the same, now you're moving to this static approach. So even if I kept the same rhythm here, but never changed their pitches, except when the chord changed, well, that's really a static approach. It's sort of maybe a hybrid between the static and the homophonic approach. The homophonic approach, it's expected that when the melody changes pitches, the other parts also change pitches, at least most of the time. If there's an opportunity to keep a common tone between chords, fine, whatever. But you don't, generally speaking, just repeat. Like here, I repeated the E because the other two notes were moving and that filled out my chord. But in general, I don't just keep the same two notes in here. I don't keep the same two notes in the second violin, right? I let the violin change notes just like the melody is changing notes. That's the idea of the homophonic texture. When one note changes, when one part changes, the other parts change. And then when we talk about counterpoint, we have all these different options. So this version, we had a motor rhythm, and the melody was sort of heard against it. This version here, I came up with a completely different independent melody. This is a very I don't know, heavy texture. It's not a heavy texture, but it sounds like a lot is going on. Right? There's only 3 instruments here, but it's starting to sound like a lot is going on. You probably don't start off a piece that way unless that's what you want, because you got nowhere to go. This is what you build up to. You might start with something as simple as this. And then maybe after you've, given me 8 measures or whatever that, now you think about and then maybe after 8 measures of that, you try this one. And maybe you let the cello actually have some footballs while we're at it, right? Maybe we could give the cellos the footballs. And again, this is a full type of sound, because now we have 3 different things happening. And then this version is the fullest sound. And here, I guess I did go out of my way to avoid doubling, so good. Now, it's a little bit lacking because now I really miss the grounding of those footballs there. So, maybe the thing to do actually is lose this and move my move this line here, move it up an octave so it's in the violin's range, and then give me my footballs back over here. And maybe I'm going to like this one. Well, I'd have to change my note choices. These are pretty random note choices. But the reality is, I really wanted all 4. I really want a quartet here. And, you can use double stops on a violin to play 2 notes at once, but you can't really, I couldn't ask the violin player to play both of those parts together. They can play 2 notes together, but they can't play 2 independent lines together very often, unless it just happens to work out and you're an expert violin player and knows how to do that. So in any case, if I had 4 stringed instruments, a string quartet going, I would probably look at that melody, that motor rhythm, the counter rhythm, and the static rhythm all together. And now that's a really big texture. And that's why quartets are so popular, because it lets you do those sorts of things. It lets you treat the notes of the chord freely, make sure all 3 notes are accounted for, and one can be doubled. And you're not constantly worrying about, if I double a note, then something is left out. So yeah, quartets are sort of a standard thing to want to write for, because it lets you do that. When you're writing for a trio, it's certainly possible. You have to think that much harder about doubling, because as soon as you have 2 notes doubled, 1 note of your triad is missing. And yeah, you want to think about triads. And so, William, I know you had talked about figuring out chords by ear and all. So you'd want to really think about what the chords are and try to, as often as possible, have all 3 notes of the chord represented like I did here. That's an E minor chord. That's a D major chord, a D major chord, G major chord, G major chord. I made sure that my chord was fully represented. That's how you get that kind of full type sound. So I said that I want to talk about counterpoint some, and I have talked about counterpoint some, but again, it's not talking about writing a fugue, right? I'm not talking about fugue writing here. I'm not talking about imitative counterpoint. I'm talking about the idea of independent parts being used to build a texture. So we have our static texture, we have our homophonic texture, and then we have various different versions of contrapuntal texture, right? This is pretty static, really, when you get down to it, because this is really just a violin going back and forth between 2 notes. It's not really that independent. What you had originally was much more independent. You had a steady stream of 8th notes, but it wasn't repetitive like that. So what you had originally was much more what I would call counterpoint. This is feeling like a hybrid of slightly contrapuntal because they have different rhythms, but still very static, because really it's just outlining the chord. So this is kind of a hybrid of those 2 approaches. This is the most purely contrapuntal approach, where that second violin has an entirely different rhythm. And then they come together there, because I never bothered to write something else there. So, So, oh, by the way, for writing for viola, I will tell you one thing to know about writing for viola. If I add a viola right here, did I not add it? I think I didn't double click it. Sorry, double click viola, and let me move it up. If I write for viola, so viola is on alto clef, I can read alto clef if you force me to. But so out for people who don't know, the crack in the cleft, the cleft in the clef is middle C. So middle C is the middle line. That is what this alto clef is, and that's what violas normally read. Most of us don't read that clef well unless you're viola players. So what I often do, I cheat. I readily admit to this, so I will show you my cheat. I will change that clef to this one here. So let me put a middle C on this thing so you can see that's middle C. What if I changed it to this clef here? Oops, wrong one. That clef there. It's the treble clef with an 8 below it, meaning everything sounds an octave lower than written. Well, that's middle C now. It looks like the C above middle C, but I can tell it's a C. It doesn't look like a B to me. I'm used to that note on the middle line. That's a B to me, or it's a D if I'm thinking bass clef. It really takes a big stretch of my brain to see that middle line as a C. But I can see this space as a C really easily because that's how it is in treble clef. So by using the treble clef but transposed an octave, the treble clef with the 8 below it, it enables me to read and write the music fairly easily. The reason you don't use just the regular treble clef, by the way, is viola parts go from C to the C an octave below that. This is the low note of a viola, and viola parts are typically going to spend an awful lot of time down here in the ledger lines, and that gets hard to read. So we don't write, and it takes up a lot of space. It kind of means that you don't have this space available here for dynamics, and if you do try to add dynamics, then it needs to add extra space and push the staves further apart, and we don't want to use up more paper than we need to, and we don't want to have more page turns than we need to. So all those ledger lines make it harder to read. They make the score take more space. So we generally like to write in clefs that avoid the ledger lines. But so this is hard for me to read. There's everything not good about it. Alto clef definitely fixes that at the expense of I can't read it. So by changing it to this treble clef with the 8 below it, that kind of fixes that problem for me. So yeah, and then you can write it, or you could just write it in actual bass clef also. If you're going to be living mostly in the low range of the viola, by all means write it in bass clef, and then you'll just switch it to treble clef when you need to go above middle C far. But for me, this clef works actually pretty well because this is also a clef that we use writing for tenor voice. If you're writing choral music, it's pretty common. If you're writing choral music where each voice gets its own staff, this is the most common staff, the most common clef used for the tenor. Now, if you're putting choral music with soprano and alto on one staff, tenor and bass on the other, then the tenor will read bass clef. So tenors generally have to read both clefs. But if you surveyed most tenors, especially amateur choir tenors, they're going to tell you they'd rather see treble clef transpose an octave because they're better at reading it, most of them. Okay, so what I did here was I said I was going to do a short demonstration and then look at student music, and what I actually did was spend an awful lot of time looking at some student music, one piece in particular, but using it as an opportunity to do demonstrations. So I did something a bit different with this class than what I usually did, but hopefully people found it instructive, thinking about these different textures, these different ways of sort of organizing what you do. So much of what I talk about is about the chords themselves, not what you do with those chords. And so I very quickly just threw in an E minor chord, a D chord, a G chord, and called it done. And I never questioned that again, other than when I noticed, Williams' original line maybe had a C chord in it, but whatever. I wasn't these different textures had nothing to do with the chord choices. The chord choices are the chord choices. The textural choices are the textural choices. They're different. And yeah, there can be something where chord choice might suggest something texturally, or the texture might suggest something harmonically, but for the most part, they're kind of independent choices to make. Whether you want to use the static texture, whether you want to use the homophonic texture or a more contrapuntal texture. You can make those choices independently of how you're dealing with the harmony. So that's that's a lot of talking about different aspects of this problem, and I thank you so much, William, for the piece and the sort of opportunity to use it to talk about these different things. And hopefully, of all the millions of things that I showed in here, maybe some of them stick, and you find out some things that you might want to do to do what you want to do with the piece. Only you know what you want to do with the piece. What I will say is the original texture basically came across as unison or octaves, and it's a fine texture, but probably not for the whole piece. So if I were you, I would have that texture. And I said I said I might have started off with this texture, but no, actually this texture is full chords. I would have started with your texture of unison or octaves, because it was a nice texture. It really worked well. But then you gradually expand on it and do other things with it. Okay, so I'm really glad that people found this useful. I'm just I love being able to do this sort of thing where I respond to what I'm seeing, and whatever issues come up, we talk about those we talk about those issues. So I will say, next week will be something different, right? Because it's different every week, and so I'm so glad that people are enjoying this. Feel free. I would love it if you guys would spread the word, and I will also do my part here in promoting myself and just point out that I have courses that you can check out here, my site here. And that's where you find all the courses that I offer. And what I would say is right now, the basic music theory course is the one that if you're not even sure, like, well, what does he mean when he talks about a D chord or a D chord in inversion? What does inversion mean? Or if these basic issues are there, that's what this course is about. The harmony and chord progressions is more about understanding how to choose the chords. Once you know what the chords are, how you go about choosing chords that sound good. And I just threw some chords in really quickly without giving it a lot of thought. This course is all about giving it the more thought. What I'm going to be developing now is a counterpoint course where I really talk about all these issues of counterpoint, and I will be starting them. So time signatures. Okay, yeah. Feel free to post me some Kika. Give me some music to comment on. And I did see that there were some other people had some stuff with time signatures. This one came up when we talked about 3/4 versus 6/8 a little bit. But I'm happy to talk about writing in different time signatures. So let's have some music to talk about, and then and that's a challenge to anyone else. Try writing in some different time signatures, maybe changing time signatures mid-piece, using some unusual ones like 5/4, 7/4, 7/8, etc. At least unusual in Western culture. They're not unusual in like a lot of Eastern cultures. So I will wrap up with this, and I'm so glad to see everyone here, and I will see you all next time. And so meanwhile, happy music making.